So we've seen examples of how genes are made up of DNA and how they are related to enzymes and how enzymes will end up contributing to a phenotype. What you typically start a genetics course with is something more like what this lecture covers. I thought it'd be valuable to maybe dive in with other content before this. This is something you've probably had before, and so most of this will serve as a refresher for many of you. If you didn't get it the first time around, I'm hoping that I can present it in a way that makes it a little more clear to you. And it is definitely the principles that we're going to cover as part of this. They really carry through everything we talk about in genetics. So there's a reason this is really the content that gets covered every time in genetics. It's just the most foundational, simplest, clearest way, I think, to present a lot of genetic principles. So we call it Mendelian inheritance. And Mendelian relates to this gentleman named Gregor Mendel, who was alive in the 19th century. He was a monk in the modern day Czech Republic. And as a monk, he had some time to do experiments on garden pea plants. So this is just an ordinary garden plant, but one that had some variation. And so this is something that we talked about before as being really the starting point for genetic investigation. So this is a cultivated pea plant. This is one people would grow to eat, maybe to have some attractive features as it grows in the garden. And while people are breeding organisms to be livestock or crops, they end up selecting a lot of times for traits of interest. So sometimes you might end up just with a single starting species with a whole lot of variation in forms that people find useful or interesting. And one example would be the pea plant here. So Gregor Mendel had at his disposal a lot of pea plants belonging to the same species, but having been selected for traits that are clearly different from each other. So there's a whole set of these that are traits that worked out in his favor as he did these investigations. One of them is shown here, just a simple difference in how these plants grow. So this is, again, a heritable trait. Tall plants produce tall plants and dwarf plants produce dwarf plants passed on from parents to offspring in a quantitative, measurably different size in these different kinds of plants. And it's possible to have true breeding groups of these, which we've talked about before. So really we owe a lot to Gregor Mendel for having the patience and insight for a lot of the experiments he came up with. They look really obvious, I think, in hindsight, but he was the first person to really do a lot of this and gets much deserved credit for it. So let's say I've got two different kinds of pea plants, tall and dwarf, and you want to know, all right, well, what causes that difference? Why is it that tall plants always make tall plants and dwarf plants always make dwarf plants? And as we'll see, some interesting effects arise if you start crossing these with each other. So just being able to, I think, boil this down to something that clearly makes sense was a major achievement for Gregor Mendel. So many examples having to do with features of these pea plants. So they have flower phenotypes and pod phenotypes and seed phenotypes and height, as we saw. And in his favor, Gregor Mendel ended up investigating many traits that had simple genetic explanations. So we're going to use the term, we're going to talk about Mendelian genetics or Mendelian inheritance based on some of the simpler principles of genetics. And after that, we're going to build into things that are a little more complex. But again, this is something you've probably seen before. Maybe going back into high school, you learned about some of these principles. So basic principles include definitions, genotypes and phenotypes. So genotype is the genetic makeup of an organism. And we can't know, just looking at an organism, we can't know what its DNA is like. We don't know what its genes and alleles are like. But what we do see is what's called the phenotype, so the appearance of the plant. And the fact that these become genetic investigations, that's down to the fact that they are known to be heritable traits, for example. So these yellow podded pea plants would be true breeding and always producing yellow pods no matter where you grew them, and so on. So clear known genetic effect with the phenotype. As far as the genotype, what makes these up, we can use this simple notation to get started. using a single letter as an abbreviation. And a lot of times these abbreviations, so sometimes they have official abbreviations, as we'll see with the fruit flies. Sometimes in these examples, you can come up with your own abbreviations on the fly, as long as you understand what you're talking about. So I'll start with an example here. This pod color, known to be either yellow or green. And by the definitions of how you define your alleles, the green podded pea plant is the kind of plant that has either two of these big G so-called dominant alleles, or at least one of these big G dominant alleles. So either of these two genotypes, big G homozygous dominant, or big G, little g heterozygous, either of those will give you the green phenotype. And in Mendelian genetics, the phenotype of either of these genotypes is the same. So really indistinguishable whether you're homozygous dominant or heterozygous. The homozygous recessive genotype, in this case, gives you the yellow pea plants, yellow pods. And for convenience, so that we know we're talking about the same gene and two alleles for the same gene, these are abbreviated also with G. So G for green, but these are lowercase g, indicating that they're kind of the recessive form of what in the dominant case would be green. Another just contrast here on the left side here, this is one caused by a dominant allele, big I. So big I homozygous dominant or big I heterozygous produces the inflated pod, and the constricted pod is due to a homozygous recessive little I genotype. So alleles are kind of the programming. They relate to the DNA stuff we've talked about before, and we'll talk about again. When we talk about these content, this information, you can kind of forget about DNA for a little while and just move forward with the idea that there's some kind of programming, and we understand the effects, the phenotype effects you can get from having a certain genotype for whatever genes you're interested in. So these alleles are programming to become some sort of phenotype. So this big I allele contributes to the inflated pod phenotype. The big G allele contributes to the green pod phenotype. And you get a different genetic effect if you are homozygous for one of these recessive alleles. All right, so dominant and recessive, homozygous and heterozygous. These should all be basically terms you're familiar with. And then this term we saw before, true breeding. So the idea that you can keep breeding pea plants with these features and keep always getting the exact same phenotype in the offspring. For the homozygous recessive, these would have to be true breeding because they have only one kind of allele. For the dominant phenotype, green or inflated, these to be true breeding would have to be homozygous. So homozygous dominant has then only the big G genotype, big G allele. The inflated true breeding would be homozygous dominant, big I. So we talked a little bit about model organisms. We mentioned these in lab. I just think it's kind of interesting if you track way back to the dawn of genetics. Really, Gregor Mendel is the starting point for genetics, and so this maybe counts as the first model organism. Didn't end up being like the major plant model organism, but certainly very important for a century or more. And as a model organism, I mentioned before, model organisms benefit from having techniques that are useful for manipulating them, so they can be grown in gardens using relatively simple maintenance techniques. And as far as breeding pea plants, kind of off topic for genetics, but if you're interested to know, pea plants are, they have bisexual flowers, both male and female components. So if you want to do a controlled genetic cross in a pea plant, you've got to what we call emasculate one of the flowers, remove the male component. So this is a purple flower plant, having its stamens removed so that pollen from these stamens doesn't end up fertilizing the female component of this flower. And instead, a paintbrush is used to grab pollen off of a different flower and deposit that on the stigma of the purple flower. So you can do controlled crosses, not quite the same as putting these into the same vial like we do with fruit flies, but making sure you have control over how the pollen is transferred. this comes down to having some knowledge and timing about life cycles. And so you can control who the female parent and male parent are in a cross, and do replicates of this through a few different individuals. I guess I should also mention that the pollen grains, each individual pollen grain ends up fertilizing a different ovule to become a different seed. So there'd be multiple pollen grains and multiple ovules in here, several fertilization events. All right, so we've seen some examples of Mendelian traits from peas. We saw the short and tall, what we were calling dwarf before. Here's just another illustration of that. Like I said, so whole plant features, flower features, seed features, pod features. And it turns out maybe not everything that was investigated by Mendel had this kind of inheritance, but the kinds of features that he used when publishing these principles of genetics that he discovered, turns out there were quite a few of these that worked out with those kinds of principles. So everything that's shown here has complete dominance for alleles and could be inherited in the way that we've seen before. So one gene inheritance, dominant and recessive. And the nice thing about this for Gregor Mendel was he was developing not only an interesting pattern, but a principle that could be applied across the whole organism. So, if you saw this only in one feature of the plant, it wouldn't be maybe as universal, but finding it in so many different aspects of development really showed us that we had a principle to apply more widely, and turned out that this wasn't unique to plants, wasn't unique to peas, but it was actually something that could be extended across everything that's alive, our understanding of genetics. So pretty cool stuff. If you wanted an update, I mentioned that Gregor Mendel was doing his research in the middle of the 1800s. And so about 150 years later, this was the update to determine that tall and dwarf phenotype was actually down to a gene that now has a name, which is not very exciting. It's called stem length gene, LE. And then it's got a dominant and recessive version, just in the same way. So the principles hold up after 250 years, but not 250 years, 100 years.